The rain hammered against the tent walls as Lieutenant Kim Tae-ho spread the military map across the wooden table. The flickering kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on his weathered face. He had been fighting for 8 months now, but this assignment felt different, more dangerous. "Sir, the orders just came in," said Corporal Bae Jinwoo, stepping into the tent with water dripping from his helmet. He handed over a sealed envelope, marked with urgent red stamps. Kim Tae-ho tore open the envelope and read the contents twice. His jaw tightened. The bridge at Heartbreak Ridge was theirs to defend. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was planning a massive push through this exact location within the next 48 hours. The bridge was the only way for supplies to reach the front lines 20 miles north. If they lost it, thousands of soldiers would be cut off from food, ammunition, and medical supplies. "Get Sergeant Park and the others," Kim Tae-ho ordered. "We move out in 1 hour." Sergeant Park Min-soo arrived first, his uniform still dirty from the previous day's patrol. He was 35 years old, which made him ancient by war standards. His left hand was missing 2 fingers from a grenade explosion near Seoul, but he could still handle a rifle better than men half his age. "Another bridge?" Park Min-soo asked, looking at the map. "This is the 3rd one this month. This one matters more," Kim Tae-ho replied. "If we lose it, we lose everything north of here." The tent flap opened again and Private Lee Sung-woo entered, followed by the rest of the squad. Lee was only 19 and had joined the unit 3 weeks ago. He came from Busan, where his family ran a small fishing business. His hands still smelled like fish oil, and he jumped at every loud sound. "Listen carefully," Kim Tae-ho began, pointing to the map. "This bridge crosses the Soyang River. It is made of steel and concrete, built by the Japanese 20 years ago. The enemy knows how important it is. They will throw everything they have at us." Private Lee raised his hand nervously. "Sir, how many enemy soldiers are we expecting?" "Intelligence says at least 2 battalions, maybe more." Kim Tae-ho watched as the young man's face went pale. "That means we will be outnumbered 10 to 1. "Sergeant." Park spat into the dirt. "Good, fair fight would be boring." The other soldiers laughed, but Kim Tae-ho could see the fear in their eyes. They had been fighting for months. Some had been wounded multiple times. They were tired, hungry, and far from home. But they were also the best soldiers he had ever commanded. "We leave in 1 hour," Kim Tae-ho continued. "Pack light, ammunition, and medical supplies only. Leave everything else behind." As the soldiers prepared their equipment, Kim Tae-ho pulled Sergeant Park aside. "Tell me honestly, what do you think our chances are?" Park Min-soo looked out at the dark mountains. "Sir, I have been in this war since the beginning. I have seen good men die defending worthless hills. But this bridge, this matters. If we can hold it for just 2 days, reinforcements will come. And if we cannot hold it, then we die fighting, but we do not run." Kim Tae-ho nodded. This was why he respected Park Min-soo. The man never lied, never gave false hope. He just told the truth, even when the truth was ugly. Private Lee approached them, carrying his rifle awkwardly. "Sergeant Park, I need to ask you something." "What is it, boy?" "My parents do not know where I am. If something happens to me, can you tell them I was brave?" Park Min-soo put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "You are here. That already makes you brave. But nothing will happen to you. I will make sure of that." The truck ride to Heartbreak Ridge took 3 hours through winding mountain roads. The soldiers sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Kim Tae-ho studied the intelligence reports again. The enemy had tanks, artillery, and air support. His unit had rifles, a few machine guns, and whatever explosives they could carry. When they finally reached the bridge, Kim Tae-ho understood why it was so important. The structure was massive, spanning a deep gorge with rushing water below. Mountains rose on both sides. There was no other way to cross for miles in either direction. "This is it," he said, as the soldiers climbed out of the truck. "This is where we make our stand." Private Lee looked at the bridge, then at the dark forest on the other side. "Sir, when do you think they will come?" Kim Tae-ho checked his watch. It was almost midnight. "Soon, they always attack at dawn." As the soldiers began setting up their defensive positions, Kim Tae-ho walked to the center of the bridge. The wind was cold and sharp. In the distance, He could see the lights of enemy camps. They were coming. The question was not if, but when. He thought about his wife and daughter back in Seoul. He had not seen them in 6 months. He wondered if he would ever see them again. The first light of dawn revealed the true challenge ahead. Kim Tae-ho stood at the edge of the bridge, watching his soldiers dig foxholes in the rocky ground. The work was slow and difficult. Every strike of the shovel sent sparks flying from the hard stone. "The ground is like concrete," complained Private Lee, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold morning air. His hands were already bleeding from gripping the shovel handle. Sergeant Park walked over and examined the shallow hole. "Dig deeper. Your life depends on it." He picked up his own shovel and began working beside the young soldier. "In Seoul, I saw a man survive 3 days of shelling because his foxhole was deep enough." As the soldiers continued digging, Kim Tae-ho noticed smoke rising from a small village about half a mile away. He had been told the area was evacuated, but clearly some people had stayed behind. This complicated everything. His orders were to defend the bridge, but he could not ignore civilians in danger. "Sir, we have visitors," called out Corporal Bay, pointing toward the village path. An elderly woman was walking slowly toward them, followed by a young girl carrying a basket. The woman moved with difficulty, using a wooden walking stick. Her clothes were old and patched, but clean. The girl beside her looked about 16 years old. Kim Tae-ho walked down to meet them. "Good morning, I am Lieutenant Kim Tae-ho. You should not be here. This area will become very dangerous soon." The elderly woman bowed slightly. "I am Choi. Seunja, this is my granddaughter, Han Ji-eun. We brought food for your soldiers." She gestured to the basket the girl was carrying. "That is very kind, but you must leave immediately. Enemy forces are coming this way. You could be killed." Choi Seunja shook her head firmly. "This is our home. My husband is buried in the village cemetery. My parents are buried there too. I will not leave them." Han Ji-eun stepped forward. "Grandmother, please listen to the officer. We can come back after the fighting is over." "No." The old woman's voice was strong despite her age. "I have lived here for 70 years. I survived the Japanese occupation. I will survive this too." Kim Tae-ho felt frustrated. He understood her feelings, but he also knew what was coming. "Mrs. Choi, the enemy soldiers will not care that you are a civilian. They will kill anyone they find. Then we will hide in the old mine shaft behind the village. We know these mountains better than any soldier." Private Lee had stopped digging and was listening to the conversation. "Sir, maybe they could help us. They know the area." Kim Tae-ho considered this. Local knowledge could be valuable. "What can you tell me about enemy movements in this area?" Han Ji-eun spoke up. 3 days ago we saw many trucks moving through the valley at night. They had no lights, but we could hear the engines. They stopped about 5 miles north of here." This was useful information. Kim Tae-ho pulled out his map. "Can you show me exactly where?" The girl studied the map carefully, then pointed to a location. "Here. There is an old logging road that leads to a flat area where trucks can park." Sergeant Park joined them. "Sir, if they are staging vehicles there, they will probably attack from the north side of the bridge. That matches our intelligence reports." Kim Tae-ho made notes on his map. "Mrs. Choi, if you insist on staying, you must promise to keep your granddaughter safe. When the fighting starts, go to your hiding place and do not come out until it is over." "We promise," Choi Seunja said. "But first, let us help your soldiers. We can bring water and food. The closest army supply depot is 50 miles away." For the next 4 hours, the villagers helped the soldiers prepare their defenses. Han Ji-eun proved especially useful. She knew every path and hiding spot in the mountains. She showed them a small cave where they could store extra ammunition and medical supplies. "My brother used to play war games here when we were children," she explained, as they stacked rifle ammunition in the cave. "He always said this would be a good place for soldiers to hide." "Where is your brother now?" asked Private Lee. "He joined the army 2 years ago. We have not heard from him since the fighting started near Pusan." Private Lee nodded sadly. Many families had lost contact with their sons and fathers. The war had scattered people across the country like leaves in the wind. As afternoon approached, Kim Tae-ho gathered his soldiers for a final briefing. The defensive positions were as ready as they could make them. Machine gun nests covered both approaches to the bridge. Foxholes provided protection for riflemen. Explosives were placed under the bridge as a last resort. "Remember," he told his men, "our job is to hold this bridge for as long as possible. Reinforcements are coming, but they need time to get here." Choi Sunja approached him one final time before returning to the village. "Lieutenant, there is something else you should know. My granddaughter heard radio transmissions last night. The enemy soldiers were speaking Chinese." This was important news. Chinese forces were better equipped and more experienced than North Korean troops. "Are you certain?" Han Ji-eun studied Chinese in school. She understood some of what they were saying. Kim Tae-ho felt his stomach tighten. Fighting Chinese soldiers would be much more difficult. They were professional warriors, not poorly trained conscripts. This bridge was about to become the site of a real battle. The attack came with the sunrise, just as Kim Tae-ho had predicted. The first sound was not gunfire, but the distant rumble of tanks moving through the forest. Private Lee was on watch duty when he spotted movement in the trees across the river. "Lieutenant, they are coming," he whispered into his radio, his voice shaking slightly. Kim Tae-ho crawled to his observation position and looked through his binoculars. Chinese soldiers were moving through the forest like ghosts, their green uniforms blending with the trees. He counted at least 50 men in the first group, with more following behind. "All positions, prepare for contact," he spoke quietly into his radio. "Remember, do not fire until I give the command." The Chinese soldiers reached the far side of the bridge and stopped. Their commander was studying the defensive positions through his own binoculars. For several minutes, both sides watched each other in silence. The morning air was so quiet that Kim Tae-ho could hear birds singing in the trees. Then the enemy artillery opened fire. The first shell exploded 20 feet from Private Lee's foxhole, throwing dirt and rocks everywhere. The young soldier pressed himself against the bottom of his hole, covering his head with his hands. More shells followed, each one closer than the last. "They are trying to soften us up before the ground attack," shouted Sergeant Park over the noise of explosions. "Stay in your holes until the shelling stops." The bombardment lasted 15 minutes. When it finally ended, Kim Tae-ho's ears were ringing and his mouth was full of dust. He looked around quickly to check on his men. Most were still alive, but Corporal Bay was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Here they come," someone yelled. Chinese soldiers were running across the bridge, firing their rifles as they advanced. There were at least 30 of them in the first wave, with more waiting to follow. "Open fire," Kim Tae-ho commanded. The sound of gunfire filled the valley. The machine gun position on the left side of the bridge cut down several enemy soldiers, but more kept coming. Private Lee aimed his rifle carefully and fired. He saw one Chinese soldier fall, then quickly loaded another round. Sergeant Park was coordinating with the artillery radio, trying to call in fire support on the enemy positions across the river. "Thunder Base, this is Eagle 7. We need fire." On grid reference 4789. An enemy sniper's bullet struck the sandbags next to Park's head. He ducked down, still holding the radio handset. "Thunder Base, do you copy? We are taking heavy fire." The radio crackled with static. "Eagle 7, artillery support is not available. You are on your own," Park cursed loudly. Without artillery support, they would have to rely on their rifles and machine guns to stop a much larger enemy force. The Chinese soldiers had reached the middle of the bridge when disaster struck. A mortar shell landed directly in Sergeant Park's position. The explosion was enormous, throwing dirt and equipment high into the air. "Sergeant Park is down," yelled Corporal Bay. "He needs medical attention." Kim Tae-ho saw Park lying motionless beside the radio equipment. Blood was flowing from wounds on his arms and chest, but there was no time to help him now. More Chinese soldiers were crossing the bridge. "Lee, get to Park's position and take over the radio," Kim Tae-ho ordered. Private Lee looked terrified, but he nodded and crawled out of his foxhole. Enemy. Bullets kicked up dirt around him as he ran in a zigzag pattern toward the wounded sergeant. Somehow he made it without being hit. Lee knelt beside Park and checked his wounds. The sergeant was unconscious but still breathing. "Sir, Park is alive but badly hurt," he reported over the radio. "Can you operate the radio equipment?" "I think so, sir." While Lee worked with the radio, Kim Tae-ho noticed something alarming. Smoke was rising from the village where Choi Soon-ja and her granddaughter were hiding. Enemy soldiers had circled around and were attacking the civilians. "We have to help them," said Corporal Bay, who had also seen the smoke. Kim Tae-ho faced a terrible choice. His orders were to hold the bridge at all costs, but he could not let innocent people die while he had the power to help them. Lee, take 2 men and get to that village. Bring back any civilians you can find. Sir, I do not know if I can do this. You can do it. Park trained you well. Private Lee took a deep breath and picked up his rifle. Along with 2 other soldiers, he left the bridge defenses and ran toward the burning village. Enemy soldiers saw them coming and opened fire, but Lee kept running. He found Choi Soonja and Han Ji-eun hiding in the basement of a destroyed house. Both women were frightened but uninjured. "Come with us now," Lee shouted over the sound of gunfire. "We will get you to safety." The trip back to the bridge was the longest 100 yards of Lee's life. Enemy bullets flew past his head as he helped the elderly woman walk. Han Ji-eun stayed close beside her grandmother, both of them trying to stay low. They reached the bridge defenses just as the second wave of Chinese soldiers began their attack. Kim Tae-ho counted his remaining men. Of the 15 soldiers who had started the battle, only 8 were still able to fight. Sergeant Park was unconscious and bleeding. 3 others were dead, but they had held the bridge. For now. Darkness fell over the bridge like a heavy blanket. Kim Tae-ho checked his watch. It was only 7 o'clock, but it felt like they had been fighting for days. The Chinese soldiers had pulled back after their second failed attack, but he knew they were still out there waiting in the forest. "Sir, I got through to headquarters," Private Lee reported, holding the damaged radio. "Reinforcements are delayed. A bridge 20 miles south was destroyed. They cannot get here until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." Kim Tae-ho felt his heart sink. Tomorrow afternoon meant they had to survive at least 18 more hours. With only 8 men left and limited ammunition, it seemed impossible. Sergeant Park was awake now, propped against sandbags in a makeshift medical station. Choi Soonja knelt beside him, cleaning his wounds with torn strips of cloth. Her hands moved gently but efficiently, like she had done this many times before. "During the Japanese occupation, I helped wounded resistance fighters," she explained. When Kim Tae-ho asked about her medical skills, "My husband was a doctor before the war. He taught me basic treatment." Park winced as she wrapped a bandage around his arm. "Mrs. Choi, you should not be here. This is no place for civilians." "Nonsense," the old woman replied firmly. "These boys need help and I have 2 good hands. My granddaughter can help too." Han Ji-eun was already proving useful in ways Kim Tae-ho had not expected. She had excellent hearing and could identify different types of enemy movement in the darkness. "Lieutenant, there are soldiers moving through the trees on the north side," she whispered, pointing toward the forest. Kim Tae-ho listened carefully but heard nothing. "Are you certain?" "Yes, my brother taught me to hunt when I was small. I learned to hear animals moving through the forest. Soldiers make similar sounds but heavier." Kim Tae-ho decided to trust her judgment. He moved 2 of his remaining riflemen to cover the north approach. 10 minutes later, they spotted Chinese soldiers trying to sneak around their defenses. The attack was stopped before it could begin. As the night wore on, ammunition became a serious problem. Kim Tae-ho gathered his men for a quiet conference behind the largest sandbag barrier. "Count your bullets," he ordered. "I need to know exactly what we have left." The numbers were not good. Most soldiers had fewer than 30 rounds remaining. The machine gun had only 200 rounds left. At the rate they had been firing during the day's battles, they would run out of ammunition long before morning. "We need to be more careful with our shots," Kim Tae-ho explained. "From now on, do not fire unless you have a clear target. Make every bullet count." Corporal Bay raised his hand. "Sir, what if they attack in large numbers again? We cannot stop them with single shots. Then we use the explosives under the bridge." The soldiers looked at each other nervously. Destroying the bridge would complete their mission, but it would also trap them on the enemy side of the river with no way to escape. Around midnight, the Chinese launched a probe attack. 20 soldiers rushed across the bridge, firing wildly in the darkness. Kim Tae-ho's men held their fire until the enemies were very close, then each shot counted. The attack was repelled, but it cost them precious ammunition. "They are testing our defenses," Park observed from his position among the wounded. "The real attack will come just before dawn." Han Ji-eun approached Kim Tae-ho with an idea. Lieutenant, there is an old warning system in our village. Bell tower from the Japanese. Time? If I climb up there, I can see the entire valley. I can warn you when large groups of soldiers are moving. Too dangerous. You could be shot by a sniper. The tower is made of stone, very thick walls, and I know a hidden path to reach it. Kim Tae-ho considered this. Early warning could make the difference between life and death. If you do this, you must promise to come back at the first sign of danger. I promise. The girl disappeared into the darkness, moving as quietly as a cat. 15 minutes later, a small light flashed 3 times from the bell tower. This was the signal that she had reached her position safely. Around 2 in the morning, the light flashed rapidly 5 times. Enemy movement detected. Kim Tae-ho alerted. His men? And sure enough, Chinese soldiers were attempting another flanking attack through the village ruins. How does she see them in this darkness? Wondered Private Lee. Mountain people have different skills than city people, Choi Sunja explained while changing Park's bandages. My granddaughter has eyes like an owl. The early warning allowed Kim Tae-ho to reposition his men and stop the flanking attack before it developed, but each small battle used up more of their limited ammunition. By 4 in the morning, most of the soldiers were exhausted. They had been fighting or preparing to fight for 24 hours straight. Kim Tae-ho could see fatigue in their faces, but he also saw determination. None of them talked about giving up. Sir, Private Lee said quietly, do you really think reinforcements will come? Kim Tae-ho looked at the young soldier's dirt-covered face. Lee had shown more courage in one day than many men showed in their entire lives. He deserved an honest answer. I do not know, Kim Tae-ho replied, but we have held this bridge for 1 day. We can hold it for 1 more. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of many vehicles moving through the forest. The enemy was bringing up tanks and artillery for the final assault. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but the longest part of the night was just beginning. The final attack began at 5:30 in the morning, just as the first grey light appeared in the eastern sky. Kim Tae-ho heard the rumble of tank engines across the river and knew this would be different from the earlier assaults. The Chinese had brought everything they had. Tanks coming across the bridge, shouted Corporal Bay from his observation post. At least 3 of them, with infantry following behind. Kim Tae-ho looked at his remaining ammunition. Each soldier had fewer than 15 bullets left. The machine gun was down to its last belt of rounds. They had held the bridge for 18 hours, but now they faced an enemy force they could not possibly stop with rifles alone. Sir, should we blow the bridge? Asked Private Lee, his finger hovering over the detonator for the explosives. Kim Tae-ho hesitated. Destroying the bridge would deny it to the enemy, but it would also prevent their own reinforcements from using it. And there was still no sign of the promised Allied support. The first Chinese tank rolled onto the bridge, its main guns swiveling toward their defensive positions. Behind it, at least 60 enemy soldiers advanced in formation. This was not a probe or a test. This was the full assault designed to crush their defense once and for all. Take cover, Kim Tae-ho ordered. Wait for my command to fire. The tank fired its main gun. The shell exploded near the machine gun position, throwing sandbags and equipment into the air. The machine gunner was knocked unconscious, but still alive. Corporal Bay crawled over to take his place. Chinese infantry spread out across the bridge, using the tank for cover as they advanced. They were only 50 yards away now, close enough that Kim Tae-ho could see their faces clearly. Now, he shouted, fire everything we have. The remaining soldiers opened fire with their rifles. Corporal Bay triggered the machine gun, sending a stream of bullets toward the advancing infantry. Several Chinese soldiers fell, but many more kept coming. The tank's machine gun began firing, forcing Kim Tae-ho's men to keep their heads down. Enemy infantry reached the defensive positions and began throwing grenades. One exploded near Private Lee, stunning him and covering him with dirt. Kim Tae-ho drew his pistol and fired at a Chinese soldier who was climbing over the sandbags. The man fell backward, but 2 more took his place. The defensive line was breaking apart. Blow the bridge, Kim Tae-ho yelled to Lee. Do it now. But before Lee could reach the detonator, a new sound filled the valley. Artillery shells began, exploding on the far side of the river, right in the middle of the Chinese staging area. American planes appeared overhead, diving down to attack enemy positions with rockets and machine guns. Reinforcements, shouted Sergeant Park, who was still conscious despite his wounds. They made it. Allied tanks appeared on the road behind them, racing toward the bridge. American and South Korean soldiers jumped from trucks and ran forward to join the defense. The Chinese attack, which had seemed unstoppable moments before, suddenly found itself caught between two forces. The Chinese tank on the bridge tried to retreat, but Allied artillery had destroyed the approaches on the far side. Enemy infantry began surrendering, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. In less than 30 minutes, the battle was over. The bridge was saved, and the Chinese attack had been completely defeated. But as Kim Tae-ho looked around, at his defensive positions, he felt no joy in the victory. Of the 15 soldiers who had started the battle, only 6 were still alive. Sergeant Park would survive his wounds, but he would never fight again. 3 young men from farms and villages across South Korea lay dead among the sandbags, their bodies covered with military blankets. Choi Soon-ja and her granddaughter had survived, hiding in their cave throughout the final battle. Han Ji-eun had provided crucial early warning that helped save many lives. But the old woman looked exhausted and much older than her 70 years. "The war will end someday," she said, to Kim Tae-ho as medics loaded the wounded into ambulances. But the pain in people's hearts will last much longer. 3 days later, Kim Tae-ho sat in a replacement tent 20 miles behind the front lines. His unit had been pulled back for rest and reinforcement. New soldiers had arrived to replace the men they had lost, but they seemed impossibly young and inexperienced. On the table before him lay several sheets of paper and a pen. He had been putting off this task for too long, but it could not be delayed any longer. The families of his fallen soldiers deserved to know how their sons and brothers had died. He began with the first letter, addressed to the parents of Private Song Dal-ho, who had been killed on the first day of fighting. "Your son died defending an important bridge," he wrote. "He showed great courage and never complained, even when the situation became dangerous. All of his fellow soldiers respected him." The words seemed inadequate, but Kim Tae-ho did not know what else to say. How could he explain to parents that their son had died for a bridge that most people would never see or remember? He wrote similar letters to 6 other families, each one more difficult than the last. When he finished, his hand was cramped and his eyes were tired. But he felt that he owed these families the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Outside his tent, he could hear new soldiers laughing and talking as they prepared their equipment. The war would continue, and more young men would die defending bridges and hills that existed only as numbers on military maps. But Kim Tae-ho would remember. Every name, every face, and every act of courage he had witnessed during those long hours at Heartbreak Ridge.